Looking back, I should have noticed the signs. But when you're in love, your heart tends to turn a blind eye to the red flags your mind is trying to wave at you. My name is Alma, and this is the story of how I met my husband and his family. Carlos and I both worked as software developers. He immediately caught my attention, not only because he was handsome, but also because he had this calm self-confidence, unlike some of our colleagues who lived and breathed code. Carlos could actually keep the conversation going about other things. "Hey, did you see the new episode of Black Mirror last night? What is it?" he asked one morning, coming up to my table with 2 cups of coffee. That's how it all started. Simple conversations about common interests turned into something more. We discovered that we both love sci-fi series, weekend camping trips, and the same terrible taste for movies. Our lunch breaks got longer, and quick coffees after work turned into dinners. Before I realized it, a year had passed, and Carlos wanted to introduce me to his family. "They're very down to earth," he assured me as we drove to his mother's house. "Mom is pleased to meet you, and my sister Sarah too. She lives there with her husband Nestor and son Lino." The house turned out to be modest, but well maintained. The toys were scattered around the front yard, like a small touch of disorder amidst the general neatness. Sarah opened the door before we could knock, bouncing her 4-year-old child on her hip. "Finally," she exclaimed, pulling Carlos into her arms. Adelina, Carlos' mother, came out of the kitchen in an apron and with a warm smile. "This is my successful son," she hugged him tightly and then turned to me. "And that must be Alma. Carlos has told us so much about you." At dinner, I watched them interact. They seemed like an ordinary family, clearly proud of Carlos' achievements at work. But something was wrong. I couldn't figure out what it was until Sarah started talking about Lino's upcoming birthday. "Carlos," she said, looking at him with her best puppy dog eyes. "Lino is begging for that new Nintendo game." Sarah but Carlos began, but his mother intervened. "Oh, let him pamper his nephew a little," she laughed, patting her son's hand. Then she turned to me with a carefree smile. "I just hope that after the wedding he won't forget that he has a mother and a sister to take care of." I smiled politely, thinking she was joking. Everyone laughed, and the conversation continued. I didn't realize then that her words weren't a joke at all. 6 months later, Carlos and I got married. We rented a nice apartment near the office, and I thought our life together was starting off perfectly. The honeymoon phase didn't last long. Literally, we had barely unpacked our bags after our trip when requests started coming in. First, Sarah called about Lino's school supplies. Then Adelina needed help with the renovation of the house. The requests were endless, and each time Carlos took out his wallet without hesitation. At first, I tried not to pay attention. The sums weren't that big, and Carlos was making good money, but it became like dying from 1,000 cuts. $100 here, 200 there. Every week, there was a new emergency that only Carlos could solve. One night, after Sarah called and said she needed money for Lino's new winter clothes, I decided it was time to talk. I waited for the right moment while Carlos and I washed the dishes together, our nightly routine, a small ritual that brought us closer after a long day at work. "Sweetheart," I tried to choose my words carefully. "Can we talk about something?" Carlos looked at me carefully, shaking the soap suds off his hands. "Of course, what happened?" I took a deep breath, bracing myself. "It's about the money for your family," I said, watching his shoulders slump slightly. "Don't you think it's getting a little excessive?" Carlos's face turned pink with embarrassment. He wiped his hands on a towel in silence, as if trying to collect his thoughts. I know," he muttered. "It's just, I'm used to helping them. I've been doing this since I got my first job." "But your mom has a good pension," I said softly. "And Sarah has a husband. Shouldn't he be providing for his family by himself?" Carlos sighed heavily and leaned against the kitchen counter. "Nestor, well, he hasn't really worked in over a year." I almost dropped the plate. Why? Carlos shrugged his shoulders. He says that conditions everywhere are unbearable. Either the job is too hard, or the boss is inadequate, or the road is too long. He ran a tired hand through his hair. There's always an excuse. I sat down on a stool, facing him. Carlos, I like how much you care about your family, but we also need to think about our future, I said, taking his hand. We want to buy a house someday. Of course, to have your own children. He nodded. Then we need to prioritize, I added quietly. It's nice to support mom and sister, but we can't do it to the detriment of our dreams. Carlos was silent for a long time, absently intertwining his fingers with mine. Finally, he looked up. You're right, he said. We really need to save money for the future. Maybe we can open a separate savings account specifically for the house. A fixed amount each month, and we won't touch it for any reason. That sounds perfect, I smiled, feeling relieved. We spent the rest of the evening discussing our savings strategy, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were really on the same page. 2 months have passed. We saved money, avoiding unnecessary expenses, and everything seemed to be going well. But one day Adelina invited us to Sunday dinner. I think it's a trap, I confessed to Carlos while we were packing. Still a family, he said simply, squeezing my hand as we pulled into a familiar street. From the very beginning, tension was in the air. Sarah was setting the table, but her movements were sharp and angry. Nestor, as usual, sprawled on the couch with his phone, not even bothering to greet us. Adelina greeted us with a tight smile, hugged Carlos tightly, but almost ignored me. The first 20 minutes of dinner were spent in awkward conversations about the weather and Adelina's garden. I mechanically moved my fork around my plate, waiting for the thunderstorm to finally break out. And it didn't take long. Carlos, honey, Adelina began, her voice soft, even sugary. I noticed that you haven't sent money in the last 2 months. Is everything okay at work? Suddenly, the clink of forks on plates stopped. Everyone looked at us. Carlos cleared his throat, and I saw him square his shoulders, as he always did when he was nervous. Actually, Mom, his voice was flat but quiet, Alma and I are saving up for a house. We want to start a family soon. The silence was deafening. Adelina's fork clattered on her plate as she carefully placed it on the table. Her gaze bored into me, cold, appraising, full of pent-up anger. Sarah's face was flushed, her eyes glittering with mounting rage. She pursed her lips, her breathing quickened, and I could see the storm inside her gathering strength, ready to burst out. The house, her voice faltered, but she pulled herself together. While you're making plans for the house, I'm pregnant with my second child and can barely afford even vitamins. Do you even know how much children's clothes cost now? I felt something explode inside of me. For 2 months I was silent, biting my tongue, enduring their passive aggression, their subtle injections, their expectation that Carlos would continue to finance their lives. But now I couldn't hold back. Maybe your husband should think about it, I said, nodding towards Nestor, who somehow managed to check his phone under the table, even when his wife was talking about financial problems. Sarah's face contorted with rage. How dare you? Her voice trembled and tears welled up in her eyes. You're so cruel. Tears flowed right onto her shirt, but I could see that they weren't just tears of resentment. They were a mixture of anger, despair, and wounded pride. Nestor, who had been completely immersed in the screen, finally raised his head. Hey, he was indignant, frowning. I'm trying, okay. Do you even know how difficult it is to find a proper job in this economy? Something broke in me. Yes, I crossed my arms over my chest. But depression for some reason didn't stop you from having another child. This phrase was like a match, held to a barrel of gunpowder. The room exploded. Sarah sobbed louder, sobbing and clutching her stomach as if I had physically stabbed her. Nestor began to furiously justify himself, loudly declaring that I had no idea what it was like to struggle with the pressure of society, with a constant sense of inferiority. But Adelina shouted above them all. "You," her finger stabbed into the air in my direction, her face contorted with rage. "You're trying to turn my son against his family." She stood up so abruptly that her chair toppled to the floor with a crash. "We were happy, until you came with your selfish ideas." I jumped up so abruptly that my chair scraped on the tile. "Is it selfish to want to build a future with my husband?" "Mom, that's enough." Carlos tried to intervene, but his mother wasn't listening. "She's poisoning your mind against us," she continued. "Against your mother and sister. How dare she tell us that we can't rely on support from our own family?" I felt like everything was boiling inside of me, but I restrained myself. Without saying a word, I grabbed my purse and turned to leave. Carlos took one last look at his mother, then got up and followed me. We got into the car in tense silence, and Adelina's screams were still coming from the house as we drove away. The drive home was painfully quiet. I stared out the window, watching the streetlights blink, holding back tears of frustration. A mixture of anger and resentment bubbled in his chest. As we turned into our apartment complex, Carlos finally spoke. "You were right," he said softly, "in everything." I turned my head to look at him. There was a conflict in his eyes. "But maybe we should be gentle with them," he added, lowering his gaze. "They won't change overnight." Part of me wanted to scream that they wouldn't change at all, that they need reality, not indulgence. But looking at his tired, exhausted face, I just nodded. The aftermath of that scene played out in the most modern way, on social media. Sarah started posting daily posts that made my blood boil. "I'm trying my best to afford pregnancy vitamins. Pregnant and losing my family. I had to cut my grocery expenses this month. Sometimes, I wonder how we'll handle another baby along the way." Each new post was even more dramatic than the previous one. A photo of Lino looking sad at the window of a toy store. Long paragraphs about the importance of family support. I've seen pointed comments about how some people get their priorities wrong. And I saw Carlos reading them. I kept catching his eyes glued to the phone screen. His face became more tense every time. One evening, when he was particularly quiet, I went up to him. He was looking at a picture of Lino's worn-out shoes. I sighed and touched his shoulder, saying softly, "You can send her something, in small amounts, just let's keep our savings plan intact." The relief on his face was instantaneous. So, as if by magic, Carlos started sending money to Sarah again, a modest amount. But it was enough. Tragic social media posts have decreased, although they have never completely stopped. Sarah was still posting photos of empty supermarket shelves, accompanied by dramatic captions about the hard life of a mother of two. Sometimes there was disappointment in her words, sometimes there was acrid bitterness, addressed to those who forget about their family. Adelina, in turn, renewed the invitations to family dinners, as if trying to bring us back to the family circle, but the atmosphere at the table remained far from warm. "Carlos, would you like some more potatoes?" "What is it?" she asked with a gentle smile, then glanced at me as if I were invisible. Sarah was talking to her brother, completely ignoring me, even when I was sitting right across from her. "I wonder if your wife would mind handing over the salt," she was saying, staring at the ceiling, as if addressing an invisible audience. I've seen it all, heard it all. But I didn't let them hurt me, because while they were busy with cold looks and harsh words, something really important was happening in our lives. TechCore, the company we worked for, has signed the largest contract in its history. The client was one of the world's technology corporations, and Carlos was involved in the negotiations from the very beginning. I also contributed by developing key aspects of the project. The result: our salary has almost doubled. The account for the purchase of a house, which we replenished as much as possible, was now growing so fast that we could hardly believe the numbers. Of course, we weren't going to waste everything thoughtlessly, but we allowed ourselves some joys. A new hybrid SUV instead of Carlo's old troubled sedan, small weekend trips, good restaurants a couple of times a month. And most importantly, we started looking at real estate listings. We discussed the districts, planned how we would like to see our future home. For the first time since the wedding, I felt like we were really moving forward. During one of the family dinners, Adelina dropped her last bomb. I was quietly eating stew, trying to focus on my food and ignore my usual coolness in communication, when I heard her deliberately loud cough. "I've seen your vacation photos on Facebook," she said with emphasis, fixing me with an icy stare. I put down my fork. Palm Springs, I won't say that this is a resort for ordinary people. It looked quite expensive. I felt Carlos tense up next to me. Here we go again, I thought. These panoramic pools, luxurious spa treatments, continued Adelina with a heavy sigh. Carlos, I just think it might be inappropriate to show off your wealth like that when your sister is barely making ends meet with 2 children. I gritted my teeth. The irony of her words was almost unbearable. Keyboard clicks came from the corner of the room, filling the gap between her accusation and our inevitable reaction. I shifted my gaze to the source of the noise. Nestor! He was sitting at his laptop and playing his new video game, completely detached from what was happening. By my count, this was the 3rd new game he had bought in a month. I took a deep breath. "Make ends meet," I said slowly, nodding at him. "There are a lot of vacancies in our company right now, including in technical support. The pay is good, the benefits are excellent." The clicking of keys stopped for a moment. And then they resumed, even louder, even more aggressive. Sarah's face took on a familiar bright red hue. "You have no idea what that feels like," she snapped, looking right at me. "Try to become a mother of 2 children before you judge us." I knew she was trying to hurt me. "Oh wait, you don't know anything about this, do you?" I felt her words pierce the air like a sharp blade, but I didn't let them go deeper. Nestor seemed to continue to immerse himself in his virtual world, in no way reacting to the growing tension in the room. I could say that being a mother was her choice. That having a second child, when your husband is not working, is their choice. That the cost of his gaming accounts would probably cover the very pregnancy vitamins she complained about on Facebook. I could have. But I just shook my head and took another bite of the stew. After that conversation at the table, I knew they would never accept me. They won't accept my worldview, my logic, my desire to build a life with Carlos on a solid foundation. They didn't want to see me as someone with a reasonable mind. In their eyes, I was just a barrier between them and the endless stream of money that had once lavished on their family. The Easter dinner ended faster than usual. Sarah continued to smile, stroking her stomach, and Adelina periodically cast sharp glances at me, full of undisguised condemnation. Nestor didn't even try to intervene. As always, his attention was focused on the phone screen. Carlos was silent on the way back. Me too, we were both deep in thought. "They won't stop," I said softly as we turned into our complex. He just nodded, gripping the steering wheel. After Sarah announced her 3rd child, her demands became even more aggressive. Now they weren't just gift lists, they were direct requests for money. "It's temporary," she wrote in the messages. "We're just in a difficult situation right now." It's a difficult situation. I saw Carlos reading her messages, and I saw him getting worried again. I saw 2 forces fighting in him, a sense of duty to the family, and a desire to move forward. I was silent, I waited. Until one day he said, "I want to buy a house before the end of the year." I looked at him, at the determination in his eyes. "Then we need to be tougher," I replied. We started acting gradually. Carlos continued to help, but the amounts became smaller. He no longer responded to every request instantly. "Brother, I urgently need $500 for a baby cot." "Sorry, Sarah, we have other priorities right now." "Are you going to leave your nephew without a bed?" "Let Nestor take a part-time job." Angry messages, manipulation, tears. But Carlos held out. When he sent Sarah the last transfer, which was significantly smaller than before, her reaction was predictable. "You've changed. You let her brainwash you." Mom was right about her. But we were steadfast. Our search for a home has accelerated. We visited dozens of options, choosing carefully. At some point, we both realized that we didn't want to live in the same part of the city where Adelina's house was located. "It'll be better further away from them," Carlos muttered as we looked at the house in the new neighborhood. "I need some distance." I squeezed his hand. "Then let's do it." We found the perfect home. And they signed the documents. It was a new stage in our lives. We invited them to a housewarming party. They came. But the smiles were forced, and the congratulations sounded like forced politeness. Sarah looked around the house with an expression as if it belonged to her by right. "You never said it was so big," she said, her voice trembling with pent-up resentment. "It's not too big," Carlos replied, "just the right one for us." Adelina was silent for most of the evening, but when we escorted them to the exit, she stopped on the threshold. "I hope you don't forget where you came from," she said to Carlos. He looked at her. "I remembers." We closed the door. For the first time in a long time, I felt that this door was no longer just a boundary between our house and the street. Sarah's third child was born in September, another boy. Meanwhile, Carlos and I have reached our financial goal. After months of searching, we finally found our dream home, a beautiful two-story colonial with 4 bedrooms, a spacious backyard, and a kitchen that made me want to learn how to cook for real. He was in a wonderful school district, just 20 minutes away from work. We spent weeks planning repairs, choosing wall paint, and discussing furniture. Each room opened up endless possibilities for us. A bright bedroom, ideal for a future nursery. A spacious basement that can be turned into a play area. An office where we could work from home. Our dreams, our plans, our life together, all this turned into reality. And then came an invitation from Adelina. "Mom wants us to come to her place tonight," Carlos said, checking his phone. "She says it's important." Something about this invitation was wrong. I couldn't tell what it was, but my gut told me that another trap was waiting for us. When we arrived, everyone was there, Adelina, Sarah, Nestor, and all 3 children, but something was strange. Sarah was practically bouncing on the spot, her eyes shining with anticipation. Adelina has a smug smile on her face, the one I've already learned to be afraid of. I tensed up. "I heard congratulations," Adelina said, her voice honey-sweet but her gaze was prickly. "You bought a house." I nodded, feeling uneasy inside. "Yes, we just closed the deal last week. This is the perfect place for—" "That's what we wanted to discuss," she interrupted, folding her hands on the table like a businessman ready to negotiate. I felt my smile freeze. "You and Carlos are young, you don't have any children yet. You're having a great time in your apartment." I slowly put down my fork. "But Sarah," Adelina continued, casting a meaningful glance at her daughter, My poor girl has 3 beautiful children who live in this small house. They need a place to grow, a courtyard where they could play. My mouth went dry. So, we decided. Adelina looked at us with a beaming smile, that you should give your new house to Sarah and her family. I stared at her, expecting her to be joking. But her face remained serious. Sarah nodded enthusiastically, and Nestor looked up from his phone for the first time in a long time, watching the conversation with interest. "I'm sorry," was all I could say, staring at them in shock. "Do you want us to give up our house?" "The house we've been saving up for years," Carlos added, his voice dropping an octave. Sarah leaned forward, her eyes sparkling. "I'm a mother of 3, she said, as if that explained everything. "I have the right to provide them with normal living conditions. You can always buy another house later." I turned to Carlos, my heart pounding. "Do you hear that? Do you finally understand what right they have assumed?" Before he could reply, Adelina's smile grew even wider. Her voice was sickeningly sweet. "I raised my son right. He knows where his loyalty lies, to his mother and sister." No, that was enough. Bam! Carlos's fist hit the table hard, the dishes rattled. Sarah screamed and pressed her hands to her chest. Adelina flinched, her smug expression gone. Nestor dropped the phone. "That's enough," Carlos's voice boomed through the room. I stared at him in amazement. "I've been sitting here for years, watching you manipulate me, make me feel guilty." His chest heaved, his hands clenched into fists. "I supported you financially, emotionally, in everything." He glanced at Nestor. "I gave you money while you were sitting and playing video games all day." Nestor looked away, but said nothing. "I listened to you insulting my wife, belittling our choice, demanding more and more." "Carlos," Adelina began, but he didn't let her get in a word. "And now, you want us to give you our house." I could see his shoulders shaking with rage, but at that moment, he was as calm as ever. "No, Mom, no, Sarah, that's not going to happen." There was a dead silence. Sarah opened her mouth to speak, but Carlos cut her off. "No, you can't talk right now." There was no anger in his voice, just a hard, unrelenting weariness. "Do you have any idea how much money I've given you over the years? Thousands, tens of thousands of dollars, and now you have the audacity to demand our house." Sarah sobbed, her lower lip trembling, but Carlos didn't let her get a word in. Adelina tried to intervene, stretching out her arms as if she wanted to calm him down. "Carlos, honey, please." "Mom, do you think you raised me right?" His laugh was devoid of joy. "Do you think you've taught me how to be a good son? In fact, you raised me well enough that I finally saw how toxic it all is." Adelina froze. Carlos pulled me by the arm, helping me up. "We're done," his voice was as hard as granite. "It's all over, no more money, no gifts, no manipulation, find yourself another ATM." Sarah burst into tears. "But the children," her voice was broken. Carlos looked at her with icy determination. "They're yours, Sarah, they are your responsibility, not mine, not Elma's, only yours." He squeezed my hand and pulled me towards the door. "Don't call us, not right, don't send me your endless lists of demands, we're done here." The last thing I saw when I left the house were their faces, frozen in complete disbelief. Carlos practically ran to the car, helped me into it, before jumping into the driver's seat himself. When we pulled away from the curb, I couldn't help but grab his face and kiss him. "I love you," I whispered against his lips. "I'm so proud of you." He hugged me tightly, and I felt his body tremble slightly. "I should have done this years ago," he breathed. "I'm sorry it took me so long to confront them." I ran my hand over his cheek. "You did it when you were ready. That's the main thing." The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Adelina called constantly, moving from tears to threats, as if trying to find the right button that would make Carlos come back. Sarah sent long messages, accusing us of destroying her family. Distant relatives whom we hadn't seen for years suddenly started writing and calling, telling us how cruel and insensitive we had become. But Carlos stood his ground. He blocked their numbers. I deleted them from my friends on social media, and we focused on what really mattered, our new life. We painted the walls in warm, cozy colors. We bought furniture, choosing each piece with love. They began to plant a garden. I watched as the weight of his family's manipulations gradually disappeared from his shoulders. One morning, we were sitting in our lovely kitchen, drinking coffee and discussing how to remodel one of the bedrooms. I think it could be turned into a nursery, I said, looking up from my sketchbook. Carlos silently reached across the table and took my hand. "Thank you," he said simply. I blinked in surprise. "For what?" "For helping me find my core, for showing me what a real family should be like, for being patient while I was thinking about it." I squeezed his fingers, feeling warmth spreading inside me. "You found the strength yourself, I was just there." Now, as I write these lines, sitting in our cozy living room, I can't help but smile. Sometimes the family you were born into is not the family you deserve. Sometimes you have to build your own. And that's exactly what we're doing. One day, one room, one dream at a time. On the coffee table in front of me, there are samples of paint for the nursery. And tomorrow, we have our first meeting with a reproductive specialist. Life is not perfect, but she's ours, and that's the only thing that matters. Write a comment on what you think about this story, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like it. See you soon.